So Nirvana the band, the show is hilarious, but there's this whole like parody angle to it, and I wanted to ask you about fair use because it's this gray line where you don't really know what's acceptable until you try it, and like everyone discusses it. And Nirvana the band, the show has like these excellent like parody openings. Like one of them was like Daredevil, the Netflix show, and it's really funny. And I like, what do you consider parody, and like how do you even come up with that stuff?
It was easy to come up with that stuff because when we first started making the show, and when it was a web series before, like when I just gotten out of film school, I had become so like sick of the idea that you couldn't do that stuff, because in film school, if you've ever been, like they drive into your head what you're not allowed to do. Specifically, you're not allowed to shoot without permits. You're not allowed to use any copywritten material, not allowed to use any copywritten music.
Hide the logos on the water bottle.
Yeah.
Oh, it's awful. And
It's
like
so limiting.
yeah, and make up fake companies for things like that. And you can understand from a legal point of view why they do that.
Yeah.
But for me, as like you could almost say like a stupidly rebellious like 20-year-old, I was like, oh, I'm just going to make something that does the exact opposite of all the things that my stupid film professors told me to do, and do it for no other reason than that they said not to do it. And so that very much was the impetus for doing it, which led to making The Dirties, which was sort of a celebration of that same type of ethos. And then when we started making Nirvana the band, the television series, it was like, how can we use parody and use all this copywritten material to show what is going on in the inner lives of these characters and show the things that they care about without them needing to talk about it. Like by having a Daredevil opening, I think, well, Community did this so well. I mean, I consider Dan Harmon to be like one of the masters of this, but by showing parody opening sequences, or by having entire episodes that are based on, say, Mrs. Doubtfire, you get, oh, these characters are obsessed with this stuff without them needing to say, I am obsessed with it, right? Like the way the Big Bang Theory would just be like, oh, I love Mrs. Doubtfire, and that they would play a like the laugh track over that line,
Bazinga.
right? It's like the opposite of that, where it feels lived in, and it feels like these characters really are getting their cues from this North American supply of media, and so that's where it came from. And luckily, our lawyers, who we've been working with this stuff on from the very beginning, use that as the reason why we're allowed to do it, because it's informing character and informing story, and there is no other way for us to tell that exact story. And if there are any filmmakers listening, like that more or less is the secret to fair use. Don't quote me.
It has to be justified.
Yeah, it needs to be justified from the point of view of your story. So a great question to ask yourself is, you're making a parody of, let's say, the show Lost. Could this be any show? Like, what specifically about Lost is it that you're taking from this? And if you have meaningful answers where it actually did need to be Lost, or it did need to be like the X-Men animated series, or it did need to be this particular episode of Star Trek TNG, you can really get away with quite a bit, so long as you're not like just abusing and overstaying your welcome. But the laws are very, very sympathetic to artists, as they should be,
I remember a while ago, you were telling me about the Criterion posters throughout the set on Nirvana the band, the show, and I think you said something along the lines of they just gave them to you and let you use them.
They did.
How did that come about?
It was ridiculous, and I'll tell you exactly what happened. We had a bunch of sort of Criterion poster ideas that we had. I had a bunch of posters like that in the old web series, but they were just posters that I had. And then maybe it was Adam Belanger, our art director, or maybe one of the writers, who had suggested that we just fill an entire wall with these posters. And it just so happened that someone at Vice knew the people who ran Criterion. And so we got to send an email directly to them telling them what we were going to do, where we were like, okay, we have these characters who are more or less obsessed with this style of filmmaking along with movies from the 90s. And they were like, oh, okay, great. And then all of a sudden we got this huge package of just everything. They sent us digital files of all those posters and then a whole bunch of full prints. And they were just like, yeah, go ahead and use them. And they sent us a signed contract that said we could use them in the show. And so that's one of the few times where we didn't have a fair use case. I mean, I'm sure we could have got one, but we didn't need it because we asked and they just said, no problem.
Wow. That's awesome.